Alright, this video is going to be on evolution. We're going to focus on kind of how evolution theory developed, some of the evidence for it, what exactly natural selection is, and kind of how it's led to resistance among certain things. Alright, to start off with, we're going to kind of compare and contrast the two big ideas of evolution. So before, around the 1940s or 50s, Lamarck was the prominent idea about evolution. He was really the first one to put something out there, and he had the idea that the theory of use it or lose it. Basically, the more you used it, the stronger it would get. The less you used it, the fact that you would actually physically lose a body part. And also the idea of acquired traits, that whatever an organism gained or lost over its lifetime would be passed on directly to its offspring, almost as a clone. This is not an accepted theory. It sounds absurd, but it was what they thought at the time. So if you had a cat who lost its ear in a fight, its offspring would not have any ears, or it would lose one ear. Also, like, if you just always worked out your upper body, if you were doing a workout in the weight room, and you never worked out your legs, your arms would be super muscular, and eventually you would lose your legs. That's essentially what he's saying. Whereas Darwin said that he went more with that organisms change over time. They come from a common ancestor. And this is all really explained through natural selection. And the big idea about natural selection is that the organisms that are best suited for the environment are going to survive and reproduce and pass those genes on. You're going to have variety in there, and so that allows the ones with the best characteristics to survive. And so the key things about natural selection here are going to be, okay, did not mean to do that. Okay, so got ahead of myself there. The key things about this, though, are that you have variations in the genes. That's a key thing. Also, that the organisms that are better are going to reproduce and pass their genes on. So it focuses on reproduction and survival. And so the whole idea of survival of the fittest, that really is kind of a good way to sum up the idea of natural selection. Now there's three ways to describe, or three types of natural selection you can come across. Directional is when one extreme is favored. So directional is this one here in the middle. In this case, it shifts a little bit to the right. Disruptive almost looks like a camel if you're looking at the graph here. Disruptive is going to be where both extremes are favored for whatever reason. And then stabilizing is going to be when the intermediate is favored. So you get almost like this massive peak. And so these are different ways that natural selection can, like different types of natural selections that you can see. And there's a nice, a little bit clearer vision. So you get stabilizing, you've got directional, and then you get disruptive. So just understanding what happens and kind of, if you look at a graph, you can tell is important. Alright, so a very good example of how evolution occurred. It happened around the time that Darwin was suggesting all of this stuff. Was before the Industrial Revolution, you had two types of moths. You had the dark moths here, which are drawn here, and then you actually have a light moth. It's very hard to see, but it's in that general vicinity. And you had these light colored trees, so the light moths would fit in better, they wouldn't get eaten, so you had a higher amount of light moths. Well, then the Industrial Revolution happened. You get a lot of smog, smut, trees become covered. So now you still have the same dark and light moths, but now the light moths stick out like a sore thumb. They're easier to pick off, dark moths blend in better, and so over time what has happened is the amount of dark moths has increased while the amount of light moths has decreased. And so this, in this case, this shows an example of directional selection, where one extreme is favored over the others. Okay, so it shifts from light to dark in most cases. Okay, now that's kind of explaining an example of evolution. But then we can look at patterns of how things can evolve. So the first is what we call adaptive radiation, also can be called divergent evolution. The name divergent is a little bit more on the nose in terms of what happens. You basically have one species that becomes that separates out into many. Okay, so like it diverge. The whole idea is that diverges. So if you look here, you had a common ancestor here of the finches, and then they diverted into all these different species of finches, like so many different types based on their food source and stuff like that. So that's an example of adaptive radiation or divergent evolution. Coevolution is when things basically evolve together or in response to each other. It's almost like an arms race. See who can up the other one. Tit for tat, if you want to call it. So if you have a cheetah and you have a gazelle, the gazelle is going to maybe get a little bit faster. Well, then if the gazelle gets a little bit faster, the cheetah has to be a little bit faster. This is going to be positive. We're like bees and flowers. The flowers get brighter colors to attract the bees. The bees help them pollinate and the flowers. The bees get their food, whereas the flowers are pollinated. And then the last one, the other pattern you can see, is what we call convergent evolution. This is basically not really the opposite of a divergent evolution. That's really a bad comparison. It doesn't have anything to do with it. Really what's happening here is you have two species not related at all that live in similar environments, so they get similar traits. So you can see these two odd looking animals down here. This one right here is the Madagascan ii, and this is the New Guinea striped possum. They both live in trees, so they have these long, nice fingers. Another example is if you have a dolphin and a shark. The dolphin and shark, one's a fish, one's a mammal. Let me say that again. One's a mammal, one's a fish. Very vast differences, but they have similar features because of the way where they live. So convergent evolution is completely different organisms, but have similar, features. Okay, we can also describe how things occur, like how fast. Gradualism is what it sounds. It happens very short, small steps. Punctuated equilibrium is abrupt changes. Something has happened in the environment or to that area. Some event has caused some drastic change. So gradualism is very slow and steady, whereas punctuated is very abrupt and quick. And often happens randomly. Alright, so examples of current trends in evolution. A big one is going to be resistance. Okay, you see this in terms of like bacteria. It's a huge issue with bacteria because we want them not to be resistant to antibiotics because we want to kill them with the antibiotics. But over time, these bacteria are building up resistance. Also, insects, they are getting used to the pesticides we're using. And there's just different other examples. Also with food, we are modifying food. We are genetically going in and making them hardier. We're putting in things to make them survive in better better survive in conditions. We're making them immune to our pesticides. We're also selectively breeding things. So these are ways that either we're causing evolution or evolution could be happening in kind of current times. Alright, so how do we actually how do we actually explain evolution? So we have two big things that really provide evidence for us up front. You have fossils, which basically looks at how things have changed over time, and we compare them, and we look at a common ancestor. And then you have biogeography, which is where you compare locations to see similarities. So if you took something from the west coast of Africa and you compared it to something from the east coast of South America, they should be similar because at one time, if we're looking at the theory of Pangea, they all look together. So you may find things from similar time periods in different continents, and that kind of helps explain how the world has evolved over time itself, like the land masses, but also the organisms. And then we can also use what we call homology, which is basically just comparing structures. Okay, so there's two structures that are listed here. You have homologous, which is, in that case, it's same structure, different function. Okay, so they structurally look the same, but they serve different functions. Okay, so this image up here of all of these, what looks like arms and stuff, these are homologous structures. Okay, so those are homologous. Then another part of that is analogous. This one's not listed on there. Analogous structures are kind of the opposite. They're the same function, but different structures, or made of different materials. The example of this we talked about in class was a bat wing and a bird wing. They're made of different materials and such. Okay, and then another structure you have is a vestigial structure. This is basically something you no longer use. Your ancestor at some point used it, but no longer is used. Your appendix, your wisdom teeth, things like that. All right, what we now use today is we compare DNA structures or protein sequences. This is our most reliable source for information. Okay, and the last thing we're going to talk about really in here with this is cladograms. And cladograms basically are a visual representation of these relationships by looking at, you know, the physical structures, looking at the molecular structures in terms of the DNA, comparing DNA or comparing amino acids. We can create these relationships. Alright, and so it's important to know how to understand them. So if you look at this diagram over here, the first question asks, which are the two most closely related? Okay, well, we want to find the two that are most closely linked, which is going to be this case, which is going to be the chimp and the bonobo. Okay, and then the least likely to be related are going to be this one here and this one here, the human and the gibbon, because they are the furthest apart. Okay, so this one is going to be the closest, physically closest. These are going to be the furthest apart when you look at the diagram itself. Okay, so just, you know, being able to look at the diagram and analyze it, that's really a key thing. And then finally, this is a way to kind of help classify things, is what we call a dichotomous key. And it's basically a set of instructions. You read the instructions and you find the characteristic that fits best for that organism, and you go through it until you find a name. Alright, and then you start all over. And I think one thing that a lot of students get confused on is you have to start from the beginning every time. You start from step one for every organism, and you go through the steps again and again until you get a name for whatever you're trying to find. So we got an example here. Okay, so we're going to look at bird W. Okay, so bird W, first up, A. The beak is rather slender and stout, or stout and hung heavy. Okay, so we're going to say that it is stout and heavy. So we're going to go to step 2. Okay, the bottom is flat or straight or curved. The bottom is flat and straight. So that one should be the Geospitzer or whatever, which it is. Okay, and then we look at the second bird. Okay, so that's not long and slender, that's stout and heavy for that first step. So we start back over at number 1. So then we're going to go to number 2. The bottom is curved. That's true. So number 3, the upper beak has a distinct bend or is mostly flat. Well, it's mostly flat. So then it's going to be that bottom one, which is the P name, Platyspitra, something like that, that word. So you basically go through and you can name these all, but every time you have to go back to the beginning. You have to start at 1 each time. It's not like they match up. But yeah, like I mentioned, dichotomous key is basically a way to organize and name something fairly easily. Alright, well that wraps up the evolution section for this review.